Picture yourself straddling a machine that feels equal parts promise and puzzle. The air is charged with the scent of hot metal, fuel, and a hint of risk, as though the very act of starting the engine is a challenge to convention. Its sound isn't quite what you expect. Smoother in some ways, strangely hollow in others, pulling you into a rhythm that feels both futuristic and unsettling. You glance down at the details, noticing unusual shapes and compact proportions where bulk usually resides, and you wonder what kind of story could produce such a creation, one that seems engineered to provoke debate rather than to conform. Was it a visionary leap, a desperate gamble, or simply a piece of design too far ahead or too flawed for its own good? The answer is layered in history, ambition, triumph, and controversy, all swirling around a machine that once dared to rewrite the rules of motion. Stick around, hit like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments which machine story you want to hear next. The Norton Rotary, 1970s-1990s, enters our story at a moment when the motorcycle world was chasing performance, reliability, and brand-defining identity. Yet this machine broke away from the piston-driven rhythm that had defined the industry for decades. The first time riders encountered its compact, almost alien engine design, they were confronted with a question. Was this the future of motorcycling, or just a detour on the road of innovation? That tension is what makes the Norton Rotary a story worth unfolding. Micro story. At Norton's struggling factory, the atmosphere was one of urgency. The company had endured the bruises of competition and shrinking market share, so when engineers pitched the idea of adapting Felix Wankel's rotary engine design into a motorcycle, it was a lifeline. The Rotary promised fewer moving parts, lighter weight, and a smoother ride than traditional engines. For a manufacturer fighting irrelevance, the gamble seemed irresistible. The first prototypes ran, coughed, and whined in test bays, generating excitement but also doubt. Management had to choose whether to commit resources to something so different. Their decision set the course for decades of experimentation. Context digest. The motorcycle market of the late 1970s and early 1980s was shaped by rising competition from overseas, escalating emissions regulations, and riders demanding speed without compromise. Traditional piston engines were growing in size and complexity, while smaller manufacturers faced extinction. Into that high-stakes environment, Norton's rotary experiment looked at once like reckless abandon and visionary courage. Microstory. The early racing efforts showed the Norton Rotary could be shockingly fast. Stripped-down prototypes on test tracks stunned observers by delivering smooth acceleration that belied their modest displacement. Riders described the power delivery as almost electric, a continuous surge without the hammering of pistons. But with that came unusual heat issues. The compact design trapped more warmth than expected, straining cooling systems. Some whispered that the bike was too hot to survive real-world conditions. Still, the roar, or more accurately, the whir, of the Rotary built mystique that Norton leaned into. Reflection bridge. The paradox was clear. What looked like a savior on paper risked becoming a liability in practice. And yet Norton pressed forward. Microstory. On city streets, early adopters discovered the Norton Rotary was unlike anything else. The throttle response was silky, vibrations were minimal, and the bike felt futuristic. But at fuel stops, reality crept in. Rotary engines were thirsty, burning more fuel than piston counterparts, and riders soon realized that extended trips meant constant refueling. Added to that were whispers about reliability, with some bikes requiring more frequent servicing than owners expected. The contradiction was stark. A machine that seemed to offer tomorrow's ride demanded yesterday's patience. Still, for those who valued uniqueness, the flaws became part of the allure. Context digest. By the mid-1980s, regulators were tightening emissions standards, and the Norton Rotary found itself in the crosshairs. Rotary combustion left more unburned hydrocarbons than conventional engines, making it harder to pass tests without costly tweaks. For a company already struggling financially, compliance drained both money and time. What had seemed like an engineering shortcut turned into a labyrinth of legal and environmental obstacles. Microstory. Despite these challenges, Norton Rotary bikes stormed the racing scene. The machine's smooth power band translated into consistent performance on demanding circuits, and in the hands of skilled racers, it shocked rivals. Isle of Man TT victories cemented its reputation as a true contender, silencing critics who dismissed it as a gimmick. Crowds were divided. Was this brilliance proving the Rotary's worth, or just an outlier success? For Norton, each victory bought time and prestige, but it did not erase the fundamental problems of cost, heat, and fuel consumption. The split identity, race hero, road underdog, only deepened. Reflection bridge. The duality of glory and frustration defined the Norton Rotary's public image, a narrative that begged for resolution. Context digest. Inside the company, tension simmered. Engineers defended the Rotary's elegance and future potential. Accountants pointed to losses and regulatory fines. Loyal customers embraced the machine's quirks, while dealers worried about warranty claims and resale values. This push and pull mirrored the broader motorcycle industry, where innovation constantly wrestled with practicality. The Norton Rotary became both an engineering marvel and a symbol of risky bets, and that internal clash set the stage for the next chapter. The question hanging over Norton was whether the Rotary would evolve into the engine of tomorrow or collapse under its contradictions. To understand that, we have to explore the deeper mechanics of its gamble and how those forces shaped its rise. The Norton Rotary, 1970s, 1990s, carried forward its contradictions into the next phase of its story, where the line between triumph and trouble grew thinner with each passing year. By now, the machine had already proven it could win races and capture headlines, but the deeper reality was that road-going models had to face consumers who demanded consistency, efficiency, and affordability. The challenge was no longer whether the Norton Rotary could work. It was whether it could survive in a marketplace that punished weakness mercilessly. Micro story. Engineers poured themselves into refining the Norton Rotary's cooling systems, experimenting with oil injection and creative airflow solutions. Riders who tested the updates noted improvements, but they also remarked on quirks that never seemed to disappear. Heat still lingered around the rider's legs, and fuel consumption remained stubbornly high. The machine was fascinating, but it was also demanding, requiring owners to adapt rather than the other way around. In a world where convenience and reliability were becoming non-negotiable, the Rotary demanded loyalty from a shrinking niche of enthusiasts. Context digest. The late 1980s motorcycle scene was dominated by machines offering near-flawless reliability, broader dealer support, and growing aftermarket cultures. Against that backdrop, Norton's Rotary-powered offerings looked exotic, but they also looked isolated. They didn't fit neatly into the mainstream, and that left them vulnerable. Microstory. Racing success became the company's primary marketing weapon. The Norton Rotary's victories at prestigious events reminded everyone that this engine, however strange, could outperform giants. The Isle of Man TT in particular gave Norton credibility that advertising alone could never buy. Fans cheered its unlikely dominance, while skeptics questioned how long such victories could continue when road models failed to reflect that same performance balance. The disconnect between race bike and showroom bike was widening, and Norton struggled to bridge it. Reflection bridge. What thrilled on the track began to haunt in the dealership, and the gap grew too visible to ignore. Microstory. Norton experimented with limited production runs, creating specialized versions of the Rotary that collectors and enthusiasts snapped up. These bikes carried unique styling, distinctive finishes, and a sense of owning something rare. Yet rarity is a double-edged sword. It can attract collectors while scaring off average riders. For the Norton Rotary, scarcity became both a badge of honor and a sign of commercial weakness. Each unit sold felt more like a boutique artifact than a mainstream product. Context digest. Financially, Norton was cornered. Development costs soared, regulatory challenges intensified, and the limited customer base meant revenues fell short of sustaining innovation. Competitors with broader portfolios could afford experimentation, but Norton was betting the house on the Rotary. The company had tied its fate to a design that demanded perfection, while constantly revealing flaws. Microstory. Inside workshops, owners of Norton Rotary bikes traded stories of mechanical quirks. Some celebrated the uniqueness, treating maintenance as a labor of love. Others grew frustrated, facing high costs for parts and expertise that only a few specialists could provide. This community split reflected the broader narrative. Was the Rotary a misunderstood masterpiece, or a flawed experiment too fragile for everyday life? Each story added to the legend, but legends don't always keep the lights on. Reflection bridge. By the dawn of the 1990s, the Rotary's contradictions were no longer theoretical. They had become survival questions for Norton itself. Context Digest. The final production years of the Norton Rotary were shadowed by uncertainty. Collectors and diehards kept interest alive, but mainstream buyers had largely moved on. The regulatory climate was harsher, global competition was fiercer, and Norton's ability to sustain large-scale production was collapsing. In many ways, the Rotary represented both the pinnacle of Norton's innovation and the weight that dragged it down. The question that lingered was whether the Norton Rotary would be remembered as a bold but doomed curiosity or as a symbol of courage in a conservative industry. To find that answer, we need to look at its long-term impact and the legacy it left behind. The Norton Rotary, 1970s-1990s, reached its final act as both a marvel and a burden, embodying the risks of radical innovation and the costs of swimming against the tide. By the time the last models rolled out, the motorcycle world had largely chosen a different path. But the Norton Rotary's story didn't vanish. It transformed into legend, cautionary tale, and cult obsession all at once. This closing chapter is where its true impact becomes clear. Micro story. On the racing front, memories of the Norton Rotary's victories endured long after production stopped. Riders who had tasted its smooth, unbroken surge of power never forgot the sensation, and enthusiasts spoke of it with reverence. The victories at the Isle of Man TT weren't erased by the Rotary's commercial struggles. Instead, they grew more mythic as the years passed, proof that unconventional thinking could topple giants, if only for a moment. Norton may have retreated, but the echoes of that triumph gave the Rotary a permanent place in motorcycle lore. Context Digest. Collectors began to circle. As mainstream riders looked elsewhere, the rarity of Norton Rotary machines made them objects of desire for those who valued uniqueness above convenience. The very traits that once doomed them, quirky mechanics, odd maintenance needs, limited production, now turned into assets in the world of collecting. A Norton Rotary wasn't just a motorcycle, it was a statement, a tangible artifact of rebellion against conformity. Microstory. The cultural narrative also evolved. For some, the Norton Rotary symbolized failure, a bet too risky for a company already on fragile ground. For others, it symbolized bravery, proof that innovation sometimes means accepting scars and setbacks. Owners often found themselves defending their bikes at gatherings, explaining their quirks while celebrating their rarity. These conversations kept the legend alive, passing the Rotary story from one generation of riders to the next. Reflection bridge. The Norton Rotary was no longer competing in showrooms. It was competing in memory, mythology, and the collector's market. Micro story. Among engineers and enthusiasts, the Rotary also served as a case study in the eternal trade-off between novelty and practicality. Its smoothness, compactness, and racing glory were undeniable, but so were its heat issues, fuel thirst, and compliance struggles. In classrooms, workshops, and design discussions, the Norton Rotary became an example of how brilliance can falter when confronted with reality. The design didn't disappear. It influenced thinking about unconventional layouts, even if few dared to follow the same path again. Context Digest. By the late 1990s and beyond, the Rotary had achieved a paradoxical immortality. Commercially, it was a failure, but symbolically, it was unforgettable. It became part of the DNA of motorcycle history, referenced whenever engineers debated risks or when fans celebrated audacious design. Its cult following remained small but intensely loyal, ensuring that the machine would never be erased from the collective imagination. Micro story. Owners who ride Norton Rotary bikes today experience something rare, the sense of piloting both history and experiment. Every startup carries a reminder of the gamble Norton made. Every ride sparks conversations at gas stations and bike meets. The bike may not have redefined the mainstream, but it redefined the idea of what a motorcycle could attempt. For some, that matters more than mass success. Reflection bridge. And so the Norton Rotary became less about the machine itself and more about what it represented. Courage, imperfection, and a refusal to blend in. The final truth is that the Norton Rotary did not vanish into obscurity. It carved a distinct space in history where bold risks are remembered long after safe bets are forgotten, leading us to consider what its legacy really means today. The Norton Rotary, 1970s-1990s, leaves us with a legacy that is at once complicated and inspiring. From the start, this motorcycle promised a different kind of ride, lighter, smoother, and freer from the mechanical pounding of pistons. What riders discovered instead was something both more nuanced and more demanding. To own a Norton Rotary was to step into a relationship with innovation itself, with all the rewards and frustrations that come with it. For U.S. enthusiasts, the reality of ownership was layered. On one hand, the Rotary engine's unique character made every ride feel special. The smooth acceleration and near vibration-free cruising were unlike anything else available at the time. On the other hand, fuel consumption was high, heat management was poor, and servicing required specialized knowledge. This meant that daily practicality often clashed with the allure of exotic design. The Norton Rotary was not the kind of motorcycle you bought to blend in. It was the kind of motorcycle you bought because you wanted to stand apart. Market-wise, the Norton Rotary never captured mainstream success. Rivals were rolling out machines that were faster, more efficient, and easier to live with, and U.S. buyers gravitated toward proven reliability. Yet, paradoxically, the very failure to become mainstream is what secured the Rotary's cult appeal. Collectors now covet it precisely because so few were produced, and because its story is drenched in ambition and defiance. Owning one today is less about practicality and more about heritage, about holding a piece of motorcycle history that dared to challenge conventions. The broader lesson of the Norton Rotary is not just about engineering. It is about decision-making in an unforgiving industry. Norton bet everything on radical innovation at a moment when competitors were refining proven formulas. That gamble earned them glory on the racetrack but cost them dearly in the marketplace. Still, history often remembers those who dared more than those who played it safe. And in that sense, Norton's gamble was not in vain. The Norton Rotary stands as a reminder that motorcycles are not only about speed or sales figures. They are about imagination, about what happens when engineers and dreamers refuse to accept limits. Its story tells us that not every innovation will dominate the streets, but even the ones that stumble can leave an imprint strong enough to inspire decades later. For riders, historians, and enthusiasts alike, the Norton Rotary remains a conversation starter, a collector's gem, and a symbol of what happens when a company risks everything to build something extraordinary. And in that sense, its true value isn't measured in numbers, but in the courage to be different. The Norton Rotary may not have conquered the world, but it conquered time by becoming unforgettable.